Hello, everyone. Before we go live into the interview here, I will just introduce how it's going to work today. The way that we will run it is that I do have some scripted questions that I will go through with our guest, and then I will open it up to viewer questions at the end, and I will announce that when we get to it. So without further ado, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, respective of where you are in the world. My name is Mark Allard-Will, and I will be your host today. But as you can see, I am not alone. I'm joined by a living legend, Arthur Slade. Arthur Slade is the author of many a best-selling novel, and he is also the winner of a Governor General's Award for Children's Literature. Arthur, could you do me a favor and introduce both yourself and your work to the viewers, please?
Yeah, I can. Well, but you introduced me as a living legend. Doesn't that mean everybody knows me? I mean, I'm kidding, of course. I am an author, and I mostly write for young adults. So I like to say people with younger minds, because in fact, just today got an email from someone who was 85 who was reading one of my middle grade novels and saying how much they enjoyed it. Is it okay? And I'm going, well, of course it's okay. So, but most of my books are for a younger audience. I have 25 books now that have been published, and they kind of range from, I love writing horror, I love fantasy, science fiction. Those are the kind of things that I write. And I also write I write comic books, and I'm even moving a little bit into writing film scripts. So I really just like to test all the different kind of waters that are out there creatively, I should say. No, I shouldn't make up words as I go along.
Awesome, thank you, Art. So before we go any further, what many viewers might not know is that you were indeed a comic book writer in the early days of your career as a writer for a short comic book series called Hallowed Night. Could you tell us some more about that experience with that series, please?
Yeah, I can. I did that. That's many years ago now. But there was a friend of mine whose name is Logan Riley, and he approached me back then, and he had drawn the first 4 or 5 pages of this comic book, and he really wanted to write it, and we really wanted to self-publish it too, because that was back then. It was, and still is now. It was it was a really exciting way to get your stories out. And so I had actually never written comics before, other than a few little tries here and there. Mostly I just wrote, fiction. And so I sat down and I took those pages and we thought up a story. And we eventually we had all 4 issues came out, and they did quite well. The first issue did really well. So we were really quite happy with it. And it was interesting for me to go from writing something that normally the things that I write are things that I create, and to take someone else's idea and to turn it into a story was kind of a bit of a mind twist for me. But we had a great experience doing it. I think that that it was also a lot of work. And that's the thing about self-publishing that I pretty well learned right away with that, writing that comic book and publishing it and getting the word out. And of course, back then, the internet was a new thing, or the interweb, whatever we call it. And I really had my eyes opened as to being creative doesn't just mean that you're going to be able to create this thing and it's going to go off and sell. You have to learn how to sell those things too.
Thank you for that. And writing for comics differs greatly from writing prose for novels. And maybe that's something that not everybody realizes. How would you describe the differences between writing for those two mediums?
I think one of the differences, the biggest difference for me, is how you think about the story. When I am writing, whenever I'm writing a novel, most of what I'm thinking about when I see something and I want to write it, I see the scene, I see the character moving through the scene, and the bits and pieces of dialogue come to me, and I start writing it all down and kind of explaining every single thing to the reader. But with what I learned from writing comic strips or scripts is that I had to think differently. I didn't view it as a scene anymore. I viewed it as an image, and it took a while for my brain to get used to that. I would look at this one section of the story, this thing where the one character pulls out a sword or whatever that image is, and I would describe that. and then I would have to think about the next image. And there's kind of a knack to being able to get those images, describe them so that, you know, an artist will look at them and turn it into something beautiful, but also to understanding how those images tell a story, which is a different thing than just using words to tell a story. So that was kind of one of the biggest things. The other thing that I had to learn is that I could not, you know, wax on eloquently about, you know, I couldn't have characters talking and describing everything, and because of course then the word balloons get bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly there's no artwork left. And I really learned how to cut things down, how to just get to the very basic kind of nub or meat of what needed to be said, so that people got that emotional impact, they got the story without a whole bunch of extra stuff. Not that there's a lot of extra, you know, stuff in my prose, but I just knew that that everything had to be short and sharp and kind of to the point, so that they got it. And I think that the third, and I'll stop after this difference, but the third difference is audience. And when I'm writing a novel, I'm kind of thinking of me as an audience. Usually, if it's a novel for younger people, I'm thinking of what I would have liked to read when I was younger, or I think of the audience I have now who are younger. But when I was writing a comic book script, in that I was thinking about the audience kind of in an offhand way, but the person I thought about most really was the artist. How do I explain this scene to the artist? And it really felt like almost like a personal letter that I was writing to the artist that I was working with, that, you know, this is what the scene looks like, and this is what you should draw, but go ahead and do whatever if you think that, you know, something comes along that's better. And I would describe it knowing, you know, that he would be able to kind of interpret that. And so it really did feel like I was just writing a letter to him saying, hey, draw this, and eventually we'll have a story.
That's wonderful. I mean, as a writer of comic books and graphic novels myself, I think that is the most eloquent way I've heard writing for comics described, actually. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
One love that we share is cinema. And you put that love of movies front and center in your novel, Flickers. Flickers captures that glam and mystique of 1920s Hollywood and combines it with suspense. But what I want to know is, did you have any specific inspirations in mind when you were writing Flickers? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, you know, I think that kind of the biggest inspiration behind all of it, other than, to me, that silent film era that I was writing about, I think that, yeah, actually this probably was the biggest influence. There was nothing else like that. Before film, I mean, we had been writing novels for hundreds of years, right? And there were plays before that. I mean, for thousands of years, we've been writing poetry. But when film came along, it was so brand new. It was, you know, people looking at this, how do I tell a story so that it's on a screen and other people will be able to view it and will be able to follow it? And to me, I was trying to imagine the excitement of what it would be like to be doing something brand new like that. And so that was part of kind of in the background. And there were so many creative things happening with film, especially the silent era. And I have to admit that, you know, when I was younger and even a little bit before I started writing this book, silent films seemed a little bit boring because if they don't talk to each other, right? So it's like, well, great, these people are going to talk and it's going to pause here and I'm going to have to going to read what they're going to say and that sort of thing. But once I had really kind of focused in on it and learned of the skill that those people had with just their faces being able to express emotion, or, you know, people like Charlie Chaplin being able to just make these amazingly funny films and yet make them very touching at the same time. All of those things I wanted to put in, you know, into my book somehow. Here I am writing a book, it's not a film, and kind of bring that love that they had, that creativity. But of course, I just can't write happy books. I tried once and it just didn't work out. Everybody died. But with this, I really the other thing I was really inspired by was this is where horror, as far as films go, horror really started, really grew up. In terms of the movies that they made back then, there were so many horror movies, and once I started watching these black and white films, and specifically I'm thinking of Nosferatu, which that when you watch that vampire movie, it's kind of like one of the first vampire movies. And then you watch later vampire movies, even movies that are made today, and so many of them still draw influence from that very first movie. So what I was really trying to do was trying to take that whole creativity, that kind of sudden explosion of horror films, and kind of meld it all together into a novel. And that was the idea behind Flickers.
That's fantastic. I've got to say personally, Flickers is one of my favorite all-time novels. Just
That's
absolutely
high
love it.
praise.
Yeah, and like I'm really surprised to hear you say Nosferatu. Well, not surprised, but surprised personally, in the sense that Cecil, the character, sorry, Cecil, the character
Hmm.
of Cecil makes a lot more sense to me now in his origin of where he came to you from as an author, and I can visually
Yeah,
see it in my mind now,
yeah,
and that's fantastic. And Beatrice in the book really reminds me with her playfulness and a kind of innocence of a young Hayley Mills, and Hayley Mills
hmm,
is one of my all-time favorite actresses.
yeah,
I love The Parent Trap and stuff like
yeah,
that, so it's fantastic.
yeah.
Um, so the Hunchback Assignments is your longest running series to date. It features 4 novels and a graphic novel. Every book in the series is a gripping page turner that reads more like an action film than a traditional novel. Was that a conscious decision when you were writing it, and why?
Well, was it a conscious decision to make it that kind of page turning? It was, and there was, when I first got the idea for the book, and sometimes ideas, often they just come out of nowhere. But this was really from me reading Sherlock Holmes and also reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and just kind of sticking those two characters together. If you could imagine a hunchback becoming a detective. Eventually, of course, he became a spy instead of a detective. But I had a real intention of wanting it to feel almost like Indiana Jones, or more modern, the 007 James Bond movies. I wanted it to be like that, except be Victorian. That was kind of in the back of my mind. I was always thinking, okay, I want emotion, I want power, I want real characters, but I want this thing to just have an engine, a steam engine, if I may, pardon the pun, an engine that will move the story as quickly as possible, so that people, I'm hoping that as they read it, they still feel the emotions of the characters, but they're just pulled along so that they're going, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe this, this person reappeared. And I wanted to also pull in that kind of old pulpy kind of fiction that they had in the Victorian era that we know that it existed, but we don't really, I mean, how many people have read Varney the Vampire? I wanted to take that, and of course, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a big influence in the first novel. So I wanted to take all of that and kind of put it into this package that was just moving along at bullet speed.
Fantastic. And your recent release, The Dragon Assassin, that began its life as a self-published title. It was chapterized and self-published
Yeah.
as an ebook for Amazon Kindle, and then went on to be published by Scholastic, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is one of the largest publishers in the English-speaking world. If you could give any one piece of advice to new writers on how to begin building their audience, what would that be?
The advice that I would give is that you have to learn what story you're best at telling and what story you want to tell the most. And I know that because there's all sorts of advice in terms of how do you get an audience beforehand? How do you build up Instagram followers? And I'm really big on social media, and in terms of, I read a lot about it and try to understand what I can do in those kind of on those different scales. But the most important thing to me is, if I can't tell a good story, or if I haven't really improved those skills as an author and found that place where I'm happy writing, then all those other things don't matter. It doesn't matter if I have 13,000 followers on Twitter or anything like that. What I need is those people that I actually have the goods to give them once I have those people who are following me. And so I guess my advice kind of generally be to be really concentrate on what it is that makes you happy as a writer, and then build out from there.
Fantastic. And yeah, I guess that leads into the thing of as a writer, you should absolutely have your own writer's voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we will hand it over to viewer questions now. But while we're waiting for people to type out their questions, you're a metalhead much like myself, and we really should bring an end.
Yes.
So there's been this age-old division between metalheads, a debate that has been gone unanswered. But I think you might have the gumption it takes to end this. So here it is: Metallica or Megadeth?
I might have the gumption. Do I dare? This might be a longer answer. I'm not sure. You know what? I have such great respect for Megadeth because they are so consistent from album to album to album, from song to song.
Yes.
There's just a real consistency there. There's a real power behind their music. There's no one else who sounds like them. And yet, Metallica, who I both love and hate, and they don't have consistency going from their first album to their last album. They're sometimes have too much pop music in. Well, not quite pop. They cut their hair. I can't believe they cut their hair. All these kind of things. The reason I will pick Metallica, which I think is here's my reason. My reasoning for picking Metallica, for all the times that they've completely missed the mark. Whenever one of their songs hits the mark perfectly, it's like right there, right through my heart. And Megadeth is hitting the mark pretty well all the time, but they don't hit it bang through the middle of the target. And so that's why I would choose Metallica, because even though I have to put up with a whole bunch of horrible albums or even horrible songs, every once in a while they hit that song and I go, yeah, that song is totally meant for my ears.
You know, I think that's the most diplomatic answer I've ever heard. Yeah, normally, metalheads want to fight that one out. So I've got one question here already from Chad, and that question is: do you work for Scholastic?
Oh, hi, Chad. I don't work for Scholastic in the sense that I'm just kind of a hired gun. What they do is they pay me for the right to publish my novel. And I think that it's an interesting relationship, an author and a publisher, because I don't work for them. What I do is I really work with them. Because so once you get a book done and you send it into them and their editors start going over it, it becomes this real kind of relationship. And their only goal is to make the story better, and sometimes to make it more saleable too, if you've made some horrible mistake in your story. So I really enjoy that whole experience. I love self-publishing too. These are both, you can exist in both worlds at the same time. But I also love working with a publisher, and Scholastic has been just great. Every publisher I've worked with has been really good, and just that there's always a different relationship, and always another way of looking at your story. That's the one great power of editors is, A, if they're really good, they'll make your work harder, and B, they'll always make your story better.
Fantastic. And Sue Slade has sent a question. My son would like to know which book out of all of your books that you have written was your favorite? Oh,
good question, Sue, and great last name, and good to see you again. Which book of mine is my favorite? This is actually a hard question, because in some ways authors say this is like talking about your children, like, don't tell them which is the favorite. And I have two answers to that. And my first answer is Dust, which was my fourth novel. And I say that because it made the most money for me. So I was did I say that part out loud? I like Dust because Dust was the first book for me where I got an idea. It just appeared out of nowhere in my head, and I wanted it to turn out a certain way. And when I wrote the book, it turned out exactly how I wanted it to. And really pleased with my other books, but some of them are longer journeys than I want them to be. Flickers is an example of a book that took forever, whereas Dust, it just came out and was kind of in exactly the form it should have been. But my other answer is the Moto books, the Hunchback assignments, because that first book too, I just really was pleased with the story and was pleased with the character. I really love the idea of Moto, who has a hunchback. He's someone with a disability and someone who's really strong, and a reader who becomes the hero. To me, that was just really interesting.
Fantastic. That seems like all the viewer questions for now. But in case there are any more, I will just fill some time here by saying that a link to Arthur's website and his work is in the description for this live video. And you can find that, of course, by just clicking on the description there. If you're new to Arthur's work and want to check it out, of course, with the global quarantine going on, it's maybe a little bit difficult to go to a bookshop. But what you can do is you can find all of Arthur's work right on Amazon Kindle in the UK, Canada, the US. You can also find it on Audible and any other kind of electronic means like that. I can guarantee that it exists there as well. We do have one more question from Sue Slade. What are you working on next?
You know, I am just finishing up the third book in the Dragon Assassin series. So I'm just on this is the part that I most enjoy about writing is I'm getting into the final draft. So it's that final time before you send it out into the world. So I'm just finishing up that. And once I'm done that, which I hope will be in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I'm kind of not at a loss. I have to decide what I want to do next because I have a couple other ideas. I could do another book in that series, or I might return to Amber Fang, my vampire series. And I'm not quite sure yet which one I'll do. So that's probably just my brain telling me, you know, maybe don't jump too far ahead. First, get this book done before you start thinking about other things.
Fantastic. So that looks like all the questions for today. But before we sign off here, I would just let everyone know that if you like this interview and you'd like to see others that I do with other authors, I'm doing one on the 19th with Hisham Najem, who is a manga writer from Kuwait. So that one will be really interesting. And then we're interviewing an independent musician and novelist from the UK, Dane Cobain, on the 21st. And before we go, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Arthur Slade. Thank you for joining me today. I really do appreciate this. It's been wonderful.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. Anytime we can talk about books and heavy metal, then it's an excellent day.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, take care.
Oh, sorry, just before we go, there's one more question that literally just popped through.
Okay.
Will you be writing a sequel to Death by Airship?
Oh, you know, will I write a sequel to Death by Airship? That is, in some ways, that will be up to my publishers. So Orca Books. So I'm sure they're listening now and going, hey, we should get a sequel to that book. So right now I'm not writing it, but I hope that I get to, because I really, that's the one book where I've never written a book like this before, where I had the title Death by Airship before I had any idea what the book was going to be about. And once I wrote it, it was like, oh yeah, that works perfectly with the title. So I am hoping, I'll cross my fingers and you can cross your fingers too, that there will be another Death by Airship 2.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome.